telling me this is what humans have been watching all this time?" The room fell silent as General Corvo of the Zin Consortium stared at the holographic display. Every other race in the Intergalactic Coalition had already spent themselves in the long and brutal war against the Kidari. Humans, however, had stayed in the background, offering aid and logistical support, but never entering the fight themselves. No human warship had joined the fray. Until now. "Yes, General," replied Admiral Merrick of Urchak Union, his scaled face betraying no emotion. Humanity officially declared their intent to engage in combat operations as of 10 minutes ago. Corvo rubbed his temples in disbelief. He had heard rumors about human capabilities, but had dismissed them as exaggerated tales of Death Worlder bravado. Now, thrown before the cold reality, there was a curious mixture of anxiety and curiosity in his gut. Why now? And more importantly, what did the humans plan to do in a conflict that had dragged on for years? "Show me their opening moves," he ordered Corvo much sharper than he had intended. The holographic map of the galaxy zoomed in on the contested sectors, where the Kidari fleet had established formidable defensive lines that dared all comers. Humanity's forces had appeared at the edge of the battlefield, a mere blip against the huge armadas of their foes. As the human warships emerged onto the display, whispers spread among the coalition commanders. Human ships were sleek and compact, carrying nothing near the impressive size or ostentatious weapon arrays of other species. At a glance, it would appear grossly underprepared. "That's it," someone muttered skeptically. Corvo narrowed his eyes as the human vessels settled into a tight formation. No bombastic show of force, no falling over acclamsy posturing. To an untrained eye, in fact, it looked almost offensively minimal. One command vessel, a handful of destroyers, and a squadron of escort frigates. A fraction of their fleet. For a time, the room was silent, considering this uncomfortable idea. The Kidari did not take more than a few seconds to react, moving their troops to meet this new threat, for it had been many years since anyone had broken their lines. And then it came. Corvo blinked, hard, his eyes refusing belief. The human ships danced with a precision that bordered on art, cleaving space with an alarming rapidity. Within a few seconds, the Coalition's communication channels were full of reports of electromagnetic pulses and sensor jamming. To the Kidari, it was as if being cast into the middle of a storm blindfolded. What were they doing? The always calm Admiral Merrick's voice cracked in amazement. "Electronic warfare," said the unsure Corvo, "but on a scale I have never seen before. No targeting systems or defenses worth the name. The Kidari fleets flailed, little more than dead weight. Human ships wove in and out of formation with an almost languid grace, firing volleys of high-velocity projectiles. This wasn't brute force assaulting the Coalition was used to that. This was something else. Warfare reduced to deadly ballet. "Sir, the Kidari's outer defenses are collapsing," the communications officer said, his eyes wide with the data streams flooding in. Corvo leaned forward, his gaze riveted to the display. Here was the moment. Would the humans press their advantage or fall back? His doubts were answered instantly as the human fleet surged forward, taking advantage of the chaos created so easily. Fluid tactics, almost as if the humans were to predict every Kidari countermeasure. "How are they?" Morak trailed off as he watched another sector fall to the human advance. "It's as if they know exactly where to strike." Corvo could only stare in amazement. The humans moved with an effectiveness that was almost inhuman. Their strategy was illogical from any conventional military perspective. Most species he had studied depended on mass, hurling wave after wave of ships against their targets. The humans relied on surgical strikes, crippling systems, and leaving the Kidari fleet to thrash about like a blinded beast. It was none of the chaotic warriors Corvo had expected the humans would become. Instead, they were methodical and calculating, disturbingly removed from the very chaos they were orchestrating. "How are they doing this?" another Coalition commander asked with a shaking voice. "We've been trying to take down the Kidari for years and barely scratched their defenses, and now this?" "Training," the human officer said matter-of-factly. "We've trained for scenarios like this long before we encountered the Kidari." Space warfare, ground combat, electronic countermeasures, it's all part of the doctrine. Doctrine. Corvo repeated, narrowing his eyes. You make it sound like you expected this war. The human officer turned to face Corvo. His expression gave nothing away. Expected? No. Prepared for? Always. The response ran cold through the room. The coalition had gone to war out of necessity, driven by the need to defend their territories from the Kidari onslaught. The humans, though they had prepared for war, as if it was inevitable. As Corvo watched the human fleet dismantle the Kidari defenses with an almost calculated intent, he knew that what was unfolding before him was not only a display of military force, but of control. General Corvo, a voice crackled through the command room speakers, slicing through his thoughts. It was one of the coalition's reconnaissance officers, stationed near the Kidari border. The Kidari flagship is moving. It's trying to retreat to a more fortified sector. Let me guess, Merrick said, his tone laced with bitter sarcasm. The humans have already anticipated that. The flesh and blood officer didn't bat an eyelash. Of course, they'll let the flagship fall back for the time being. It's an old ploy, push them to their last bastion where they feel safe. Then take that away. You're playing with them? Corvo asked, incredulous. Not playing, the human officer corrected, his voice flat. We're making sure that when they fall completely, no room for recovery, no chance to regroup. This war has dragged on because everyone fought piecemeal. We don't. Corvo turned back to the map, watching the Kidari fleet scramble in an attempt to reposition. Panic had clearly set in. The humans had broken the rules never written of this conflict, operating on a level the Kidari had never encountered. As more and more sectors fell under human control, it became clear that the Kidari weren't just losing a battle, they were being undone. We're getting reports of ground operations, announced the tactical officer, eyes wide with shock. The humans have deployed soldiers to key Kidari planets. Morak let out a low hiss. How are they already launching ground assaults? We've barely established space superiority. The human officer crossed his arms, his eyes fixed on the map. Parallel operations. While space forces are disrupting and dismantling enemy fleets, the ground units secure key installations. We train for this to overwhelm on multiple fronts simultaneously. A knot in his stomach began to tighten. Each of the coalition forces had fought on one front at any given time, strained hard to balance the demands between space and ground combat. But the humans, they seemed to have mastered both, their plan unfolding with a coordination that bordered on being inhuman. Ground reports coming in, the communications officer said, his voice barely above a whisper. The humans have neutralized the Kidari planetary defenses, no significant resistance. Corvo nearly choked on his disbelief. The Kidari planets were fortresses, shielded and armed to the teeth. Coalition forces had tried for months, even years, to breach them with little to show for their efforts. Yet here were the humans, taking those planets in mere moments. What kind of soldiers are they? Someone whispered, giving voice to the question on everyone's mind. Our soldiers can adjust, the human officer responded matter-of-factly. We train them not just to fight, but to think, to analyze, adapt, and exploit weaknesses in real time. The room fell silent while the coalition officers digested this. War, to the humans, had become a science. Victory was less a function of raw power, but more one of precision. And that was terrifying. What is their next move? Corvo found himself asking. Though he wasn't sure, he wanted to know the answer. The flagship, the human officer replied with no hesitation whatsoever. They'll let retreat, and then they'll cut off every route back to safety. Once isolated, the Kidari command will have no choice but to raise the white flag or be wiped out. So that's it? Merrick asked with a wide-eyed stare. They're already anticipating the endgame. Anticipating. The human officer sneered, a flicker of humor crossing his face for the first time. No, they're enacting it. This war was over the moment we entered. The coalition commanders exchanged uneasy glances. It wasn't simply a factor of the humans' tactics or technology, which unsettled them, it was their attitude. They approached war as an equation to be solved, each variable accounted for, each outcome weighed. The room hushed once more as the humans continued their advance. More and more Kidari worlds darkened on the map, one after another like stars winking out in a great night sky. The holographic display now showed the Kidari flagship in retreat toward its last stronghold, pursued not by a swarm of human ships, but by a calculated, relentless force. What happens if the Kidari surrender? Corvo asked, almost fearing the answer. The human officer's eyes narrowed. Then they live, he said simply. We don't fight to annihilate. We fight to win, and to make sure no one ever thinks of challenging us again. Corvo nodded, swallowing hard. There was a cold logic to it, a ruthlessness that defied everything he had ever known about warfare. The humans had entered the battlefield not just to win, but to redefine what winning meant. As the map continued to change, with Kidari's last bastion about to fall, Corvo knew this was just the tip of the iceberg, but he had little idea as to what. The tension remained in the room as the holographic display flashed down to the last stages of the human offensive. What was once an indomitable giant, the Kidari flagship now appeared little and insignificant, limping to its last fortified sector. Scarring covered its hull, its thrusters flickering erratically on and off, while what was once its mighty escorts were no more than debris scattered across space. Corvo looked around at the command center, where the Coalition officers stared in dumbfounded amazement. Some faces showed awe, others terror, but no one could conceal a fascinated interest in what the humans were doing. Just 5 hours ago, the Kidari were supposed to be invincible. Now their defeat was already looking not just possible, but certain. Human fleet closing in on flagship fallback point, the tactical officer reported, his voice shaking. They've circled the sector, cutting off every escape route. Any Kidari reinforcements? Corvo asked, already knowing what the reply would be. None, sir. The humans they've cut through their supply lines and the reserve forces, the officer said, shaking his head. It's all over. They have no place left to retreat to. Corvo watched as the human ships fell into a tight encirclement around the flagship's last bastion of refuge. No grandiose gestures, no ultimatums were given, just waiting in place, their formation a silent declaration of dominance. It was as plain a statement as it would have been if it had been spoken aloud. There is no escape. The human officer was serene in their midst, the Coalition commanders, and finally tilted his head. We are broadcasting terms of surrender, he said. The Kidari have 5 minutes to comply. Otherwise, we commence final neutralization. Morak growled softly, eyes fixed on the screen. And if they refuse to surrender, he asked, not bothering to keep the disdain from his voice. You just wipe them out. The human officer didn't flinch. If they don't accept the terms, yes, he said with equanimity. But understand what we are after is not destruction. It's resolution, the end of a conflict so decisively that it cannot resume. A knot formed in his stomach as Corvo realized that humans were indeed on a different wavelength, one where war had absolutely nothing to do with glory or honor, but with efficiency and finality. They gave no quarter for doubt. War to them was a peacekeeping measure, bending space into a shape where rebellion would be utterly impracticable. The Kidari flagship is responding, the communications officer cut in, tension lacing his voice. They're requesting terms. A murmur ran through the Coalition command room. Was it possible? After years of war? Was this it? Put it on, Corvo ordered, striving for an air of authority that didn't quite ring true in the face of impossible situation unfolding before them. The holographic display rippled and changed, disclosing the bridge of the Kidari flagship. Its commander came on screen, his eyes ablaze with a mixture of rage and fear. His uniform was disheveled, and the once imposing man was down to a semblance of controlled panic. We accept your terms, human, he spat, shaking in voice. You know very well you won just because of guile and deception, not because you were stronger. The human officer stepped forward, his face impassive. You lost because you relied on old doctrines, outdated by eons, he calmly said. Strength lies not in brute force, but in adaptability, in understanding every facet of conflict. We offered you a chance to end this peacefully long before today. You chose otherwise. The Kidari commander glared at him, but his defiance was hanging by a thread. For what felt like an eternity, it actually seemed he might lash out, reject the terms out of sheer spite. But then he glanced around his own bridge, at the faces of his officers, and the weight of reality settled in. The humans had cornered them, taken away every advantage, and now the galaxy's eyes were on this final moment. Very well, the commander muttered, his head bowed in defeat. We surrender. There was a collective ripple of shock through the Coalition command room. Over. Just like that, years of bloody attrition, so many lives sacrificed, and so much valuable resources spent ended now. In less than 5 hours after humanity joined the fight, it was so final that for a second, Corvo could not utter another word. Transmission confirmed, the communications officer announced, making little effort to hide his own surprise. The Kidari have ordered all remaining forces to stand down. The human officer nodded to Coalition commanders. This war is now officially over, he stated flatly. Our ships will start the process of stabilizing the Kidari systems. You're clear to pull your Coalition forces back to your respective territories. Corvo opened his mouth to say something, and words failed him. It was surreal the Kidari defeated, and not in some long, grinding campaign, but a surgical strike that lasted a scant few hours. In one engagement, humanity had managed what the rest of the galaxy had failed to do in years. More than that, though, they'd rewritten the very paradigm of war. How? Corvo finally managed, his voice little more than a whisper. How does one prepare for something such as this? To bring an end to war so quickly? The human officer stared at him with inscrutable eyes. We are from a world where the struggle for survival is native, inborn. To survive, we had to learn to adapt, improvise, and eliminate threats once and for all. Victory is not our objective, it is a means toward an end, peace which others will think twice before attempting to take away from us. Corvo nodded, the words slowly sinking in. This was not about power, but about understanding readiness for every eventuality. Humans had refined a methodology, their minds trained in such a way that reached a brutal efficiency that set them apart. They didn't just enter the war, they transcended it. And in so doing, they showed everyone that victory belonged not to who fought the longest, but to who fought smartest. As Coalition officers scattered, Corvo watched the human fleet regroup across the holographic map. The same silent elegance they used in combat now shifted to their goals after the war: stabilization, reconstruction. They weren't conquerors basking in glory, but pragmatists laying down the foundation for what came next. It was a feeling Corvo had not experienced in many years, a strange sense of hope mixed with an edge of fear. Humanity showed what they were capable of, and the galaxy would never be the same. They'd rewritten the rules of war, and with that had forged a path to peace that might actually last. This war ended not with a grand finale, but with the realization that humanity, in their calculated brilliance, knew exactly when and how to win all along.